What if ambition is quietly subtracting from your wealth? Most of us were taught that success equals more hours, more trades, and more stress. But there's a point where effort becomes force, and force creates friction that shows up in your paycheck, your portfolio, and your health. This isn't about stopping your ambition. It's about removing the waste from your effort. There's a middle path that lets you build wealth without burning out. Most of us grew up with a simple formula. Work harder than the next person, outlast them, push through the resistance, and eventually you win. But somewhere along the way, that formula stopped working for a lot of people. The extra hours didn't produce extra results, and the extra effort didn't create extra money. Instead, it created something else entirely. Friction builds when effort becomes force. Think of your mind like a pond. When the surface is disturbed, you can't see the bottom, and the more you stir it, the murkier it gets. Calm isn't lazy, it's the clarity you need. The late night at the desk becomes a badge of honor. The Sunday email becomes proof of commitment. Your exhaustion is framed as dedication. But beneath the praise, something else is building. Resistance shows up long before burnout does. This video is about 3 places where that friction costs you real money. Your career, your investing, and the health costs you don't see coming until they land. The alternative isn't about doing less. It's about removing the force from the effort. Let's start with the place you spend most of your waking hours. A 2026 poll found that 2 out of 3 workers in the United States report burnout, and the numbers keep climbing without any real sign of slowing down. Soon, among younger workers, it runs even higher. 3 out of 4 Gen Z employees say they feel burned out right now. And that should tell us something important about exactly where the culture is heading. This isn't a personal failure, it's a cultural signal. When you push past your capacity for too long, something called the stress-productivity paradox kicks in and quietly drains the quality of everything you try to produce. The harder you push without rest, the less effective and innovative you become. You're not getting more done, you're just staying busy longer, and busy is not the same as productive. In fact, busy is often the enemy of the work that actually matters. The financial cost is real, but it's spread out so thin that most people don't add it up. A company with 1,000 employees loses roughly $5 million every year from burnout alone. And that's only the cost that the accountants can actually track on their own internal spreadsheets. That's not abstract. It shows up as missed promotions, poor decisions under pressure, and relationships at work that fray until they break. For you personally, it might look like the raise you didn't get because you were simply too exhausted to perform well that day, or the project you mishandled because you'd been running on fumes. You showed up, but you weren't really there. There's also a deeper cost that the culture doesn't talk about. Chronic workplace stress contributes to an estimated 120,000 deaths in the United States every single year, and that number has remained stubbornly high for far too many years. That's not a statistic about comfort. It's a measure of force, meeting biology. And here's the part that makes it worse. When organizations see burnout, they often tell workers to be more resilient, which is basically telling someone to just swim harder in a pool that is slowly and quietly draining away every day. But resilience rhetoric backfires when the system itself is broken. Telling someone to endure a flawed design isn't a solution. It's a trap. And this same force doesn't just affect how you earn. It affects what you keep. There's a number from behavioral finance research that surprises almost everyone who actually hears it for the very first time. And we're going to take a really close look at that next. Here's what that number looks like in plain terms. For decades, behavioral economists have studied individual investors, and they found something that sounds backwards until you think about it. The investors who trade the most actively earn annual returns roughly 6.5 percentage points lower than the people who simply buy and hold through the market's ups and downs. That difference isn't about luck or timing. It's about behavior. Let that sit for a moment. That gap is 6.5 percentage points every single year, which means you're quietly paying a massive hidden tax on every bit of your own personal anxiety. That isn't a small fee. It's the tax on trying too hard. Over 20 years, that gap swallows most of the wealth you thought you were building. The reason isn't complicated. It happens because fear of losing money and the regret of missing out work together to override your logic when you're under the kind of chronic stress that your own constant overwork creates. The same nervous system that pushes you to answer emails at midnight is the one that pushes you to check your portfolio every morning and make tweaks that feel productive but aren't. Each trade feels like control, but the data shows it's the opposite. Think of two investors who start with the same amount of money. One sets a plan in January and checks it once a quarter. The other checks their phone every day, reacting to every headline and market twitch. At the end of 5 years, the first investor has likely earned significantly more actual money overall, and they spent far less energy and focus getting there every single day. The second investor stayed busier. But busy isn't richer, and here's why. The best businesses are very hard to ruin, no matter how much someone tries to micromanage them with constant, little tweaks and all of that unnecessary and wasteful daily interference in the actual market. Your portfolio works the same way. Patience isn't passive, it's a form of control that actually works. Force creates friction in markets just like it does in meetings. But staying with what works carries you forward without burning you out. And there's one more invoice that arrives later. The health costs of overwork don't send a monthly statement. They build silently year after year until one day the bill comes due all at once. You won't see it coming because there's no warning letter. The World Health Organization has formally classified burnout as an occupational phenomenon, not a character flaw. That matters because it shifts the blame from you to the system. But the system won't pay your medical bills, and you'll be the one left holding the debt. When you keep pushing past your limits for too long, your body starts to collect what it's owed. The medical costs stack up, and the lost earning years add up. The compounding effect of chronic stress on your long-term wealth is something almost no one sitting at their own desk actually calculates when they're pulling another late night in their office. And the longer you wait, the steeper the price becomes. Picture someone who has hit every financial milestone they set. They landed the title, the salary, and the account balance, but they arrive with a body that needs repair, a mind that won't rest, and a spirit that feels hollow because the force has consumed everything else they had to give along the way. They built the wealth, but they didn't build the life that could hold it. The body doesn't negotiate, and it collects what you owe regardless. There's no payment plan, and there's no extension. You can ignore the debt for many years if you want, but the bill always arrives at your door with interest that compounds way faster than your actual savings ever could. Here's what you can do with all of this. Wu Wei is the ancient teaching of non-action. But non-action isn't passivity, it's effort that finds its own natural shape, like water that finds the lowest point without forcing its way through rock. Water doesn't struggle, it simply follows the shape of what is already there. Right livelihood in a modern job looks like the meeting where you tell the truth when lying would be easier. It looks like the boundary you hold even when holding it costs you something. It isn't grand, and it's simply daily. And it pays better in the long run than the exhausting performance of overwork because honesty and boundaries build real trust, and trust builds wealth that actually lasts. Non-attachment doesn't mean you stop caring about your work or your income. It means you stop letting the outcome decide how you feel about yourself. That's a small shift with enormous consequences. When you aren't desperate for the result, you make clearer decisions about money, you trade less, and you work fewer hours with more focus. You earn more because you're present instead of panicked, and your clarity becomes an asset that compounds quietly in the background over many long and demanding years. The investor who checks their portfolio once a quarter isn't less committed than the one who checks it daily and reacts to every little market move. They're simply less attached to the noise. The worker who leaves at 5 isn't less ambitious than the one who stays until 9. They're simply more aligned with what actually produces results. The middle path isn't about wanting less, and it isn't about pretending you don't care about money or your own personal success in your actual daily life. It's about tying your worth less tightly to every single outcome. You can want the wealth and still let the process breathe. That's where the real returns live. Force creates friction, but flowing with what works will carry you forward without burning out. That's the difference that changes everything. That's the shift we're talking about. Wealth built on forced effort costs more than it pays, and the sooner you shift away from that constant force, the more of it you get to keep. If this landed, share it with someone who's navigating the same path, and subscribe, because we go deeper every